Hospitals are places of healing, where lives are saved and health is restored. Yet, within their sterile corridors and patient rooms, there are tales that defy explanation, stories that send chills down the spine, and make even the most seasoned medical professionals question the boundaries between the known and the unknown. Today, in this video, we will share with you 5 such disturbing true hospital horror stories, each recounting personal experiences that blur the line between reality and the supernatural. Back in 2008, I was a newly minted nurse, eager to make a difference in the lives of my patients. I had been assigned to the night shift in the intensive care unit, ICU, of a large metropolitan hospital. The ICU was a place of constant vigilance, where the beeping of monitors and the hum of ventilators created a symphony of life-saving technology. One night, around 2 a.m., I was making my rounds when I noticed Room 304's door slightly ajar. The patient, Mr. Thompson, was an elderly man who had been in a coma for weeks following a severe stroke. As I approached, I heard a faint whispering sound coming from his room. Puzzled, I stepped inside, expecting to find a family member or perhaps a colleague. To my surprise, the room was empty except for Mr. Thompson. The whispering continued, a soft, unintelligible murmur that seemed to fill the air. I checked the monitors. Everything was normal. Leaning closer to Mr. Thompson, I realized the whispering was coming from him. His eyes remained closed, his body motionless, yet his lips moved ever so slightly, emitting that eerie sound. I couldn't make out any words, just a continuous stream of murmurs. I gently called his name, hoping for a response, but there was none. The whispering persisted, sending a shiver down my spine. I decided to document the incident and informed the attending physician, who dismissed it as a possible neurological phenomenon. Over the next few nights, the whispering continued at the same time. Some of my colleagues reported hearing it too, though others heard nothing unusual. One night, driven by curiosity and a touch of fear, I recorded the sound on my phone. When I played it back, the whispering was clearer, but still indecipherable. Determined to find an explanation, I consulted a neurologist who suggested it might be a form of locked-in syndrome, where a patient is conscious but unable to move or communicate verbally. However, this didn't fully explain the timing or the nature of the whispers. Then one night, the whispering stopped. Mr. Thompson's condition remained unchanged, but the eerie murmurs ceased as abruptly as they had begun. A few days later, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. Haunted by the experience, I revisited the recording. This time, with the help of audio enhancement software, I could make out a few words. Help, cold, and dark. It was as if Mr. Thompson had been trapped between worlds, trying to communicate his plight. To this day, I wonder if those whispers were a manifestation of his trapped consciousness or something more supernatural. The experience left me with a profound respect for the mysteries of the human mind and the thin veil that separates life from death. In 2012, I was a 25-year-old nurse working the night shift in a small rural hospital. The facility had been around since the early 1900s, and over the years, staff had whispered about strange occurrences, phantom footsteps, flickering lights, and unseen hands brushing against them in empty hallways. I never put much thought into those stories. I was focused on my job, and besides, I believed there was a logical explanation for everything. That belief changed on a cold autumn night. It was around 3 a.m. The hospital was eerily silent, and I was finishing up some paperwork at the nurses' station. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound breaking the silence. That's when I saw her. At the far end of the dimly lit hallway, a woman stood motionless. She was dressed in an outdated white nurse's uniform, a long dress, white stockings, and a stiff cap perched on her neatly tied-up hair. Her posture was rigid, her hands clasped in front of her. At first, I assumed she was a colleague from another department, but something felt off. The uniform was unlike anything worn in modern times, and her presence sent a strange chill down my spine. I called out, "Excuse me? Can I help you?" She didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly and walked towards room 212. Her movements were unusual, not quite floating, but eerily smooth, as if her feet barely touched the floor. I hesitated, a sinking feeling creeping into my stomach. Something about her felt wrong, but my rational mind told me she was just a lost staff member or visitor. Summoning my courage, I followed her. As I approached room 212, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of the monitor casting shadows across the walls. The patient in the bed, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins, was sound asleep. But what caught my attention was the woman in white standing by her bedside. She was still staring down at Mrs. Jenkins, her head slightly tilted as if she were examining her. My pulse quickened. "Ma'am," I said, stepping inside, "visiting hours ended a long time ago." She didn't react. She didn't move. She just stood there, her face hidden from view. Something about her posture made my skin crawl. I reached for the light switch, my fingers trembling, and flipped it on. The room flooded with brightness. She was gone. My breath hitched. I scanned the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was nowhere she could have gone. The window was shut and the bathroom door was open, revealing nothing but an empty space. Mrs. Jenkins stirred slightly in her sleep, but remained unaware of the chilling presence that had been standing beside her just seconds ago. I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. I knew what I had seen. The woman was there, solid, real, but now she had vanished without a trace. Refusing to be alone with my thoughts, I rushed to the nurses' station and called security. When they arrived, I explained what had happened. They checked the security cameras, but to my horror, there was no footage of the woman in white. The cameras showed me walking toward room 212, but the hallway was empty. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, that exhaustion had played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. That night, I had seen something beyond explanation. No one believed me. My colleagues dismissed it as exhaustion, a trick of the mind caused by the long night shifts. Some even laughed it off, telling me I had let the hospital ghost stories get to me. But I knew what I saw. That woman wasn't just a shadow or a figment of my imagination. She was real, or at least she had been in that moment. For weeks, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, motionless, by Mrs. Jenkins' bedside. Was she really a nurse from the past, forever lingering in the halls of this hospital? Or was she something else, something I wasn't meant to see? Even now, I still wonder. In 2015, I was working the night shift in the pediatric ward of a large hospital. It was a quiet night and most of the children were asleep. The soft beeping of monitors and the occasional rustle of nurses moving through the halls were the only sounds. At around 12:30 a.m., I went to check on a 5-year-old boy named Alex, who had recently undergone surgery. His room was dimly lit, the soft glow from the hallway spilling in through the slightly open door. As I stepped inside, I heard laughter, a child's giggle, light and playful. I glanced at Alex, expecting to see him awake, but he was asleep, his breathing slow and steady. My eyes darted to the corner of the room, where I was certain the sound had come from. Nothing. I stood there for a moment, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a sound from the hallway, but I hadn't heard any footsteps, and the laughter had been inside the room. Shaking off the unease, I continued my rounds. About an hour later, I was at the nurses' station, going over patient charts, when something caught my eye. A little girl in a hospital gown ran across the hallway. I blinked, my heart picking up speed. No child was supposed to be out of bed this late. I immediately got up and followed her. She turned the corner, heading toward the playroom. I quickened my pace, expecting to find her inside. But when I stepped in, my breath caught in my throat. The playroom was completely still. The rocking horse near the window swayed slightly, as if someone had just been on it. A teddy bear lay on the floor, though I clearly remembered it being on the shelf earlier in the evening. I stepped further in, my eyes scanning every inch of the room. I checked behind the small bookshelf, under the tables. Nothing. It didn't make sense. I was sure I had seen a little girl running here. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The laughter, the girl in the hallway, the rocking horse, it wasn't my imagination. The next night, I was speaking to a fellow nurse when I hesitantly asked, "Has anyone ever seen anything strange here at night?" She looked at me for a moment, then simply said, "You saw her, didn't you?" I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe I had made a mistake, that I was just tired, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen her, and I wasn't the only one. In 2018, I was working the night shift at a small psychiatric hospital. It wasn't a place where you heard ghost stories. People were too busy dealing with real-life struggles. Patients came and went, some recovering, others lost in their own minds. I had worked there for over a year and thought I had seen everything. But one night, something happened that I still can't explain. It was around 2 a.m., and the ward was unusually silent. I was at the nurse's station, catching up on paperwork, when I noticed a call light blinking on the monitor. Room 17. I frowned. That room had been empty for weeks. No patients, no staff assigned to it. At first, I thought it was just a malfunction. It happened sometimes, old wiring or a glitch in the system. But something about it bothered me. Just to be sure, I decided to check. I walked down the dimly lit hallway, the soles of my shoes barely making a sound. The hospital always had this heavy stillness at night, like the walls had absorbed too much suffering and sadness. When I reached room 17, I hesitated for a second before pushing the door open. The room was dark. The bed was neatly made, the blinds half drawn, and the remote for the call button lay untouched on the nightstand. Yet, the call light had definitely been pressed. I sighed, convinced it was a simple electrical issue, and stepped inside. The air felt noticeably colder than in the hallway, not just a small drop in temperature, a deep, unnatural chill that made my breath feel heavier. Then, before I could react, I heard it, a click, the sound of a bathroom door unlocking. I turned sharply, my heart hammering in my chest. The bathroom door was slightly open, though I was sure it had been shut when I walked in. The darkness beyond it felt thick, almost like it was hiding something. I reached for the light switch, and as soon as I flipped it on, the bulb flickered erratically before settling into a dim, weak glow. I stepped closer, peering into the small tiled space. No one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I backed away, turning off the light as I left. Just as I reached the door, a sound sent a cold wave of fear through me, the distinct, unmistakable sound of a chair scraping against the floor. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the nurse's station, I must have looked pale, because my colleague, Lisa, immediately asked what was wrong. I hesitated, then told her about the call light, the open door, and the sound I had just heard. She listened silently, then let out a slow breath. "That room," she said, lowering her voice. "You don't know about room 17? I shook my head. She leaned in slightly. "A few years ago, a patient named Daniel stayed there. He had schizophrenia. He always said there was something in that bathroom. Every night he begged to be moved. One night he hanged himself in there." A chill crawled up my spine. "Since then," Lisa continued, "the call light goes off sometimes, even when no one's in there." Some nurses hear noises, others—" She hesitated. "Some say they see shadows." I swallowed hard, trying to push away the fear settling in my chest. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the call light, the bathroom door, the chair moving on its own. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But from that night on, I never went into room 17 alone. And I never ignored its call light again. In 2021, I was working the night shift at a small hospice facility, a quiet place where patients spent their final days in peace. My job was emotionally heavy, but I found comfort in knowing that I was helping people through their last moments. One patient, Mrs. Holloway, stood out from the rest. She was in her late 80s, frail but still sharp-minded. Her deep-set eyes always seemed to be watching, as if she knew things no one else did. She rarely spoke, but when she did, it was always something that made me pause and think. The first time I met her, she did something strange. As I adjusted her IV, she reached out and gently touched my wrist, her thin fingers ice cold against my skin. She studied me for a moment before whispering, "You're kind, but you need to be careful." I gave her a small smile, thinking she was just confused. "Careful of what, Mrs. Holloway?" She didn't answer at first. Her cloudy blue eyes drifted toward the dark corner of the room, her expression tightening. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "The man with no face." A strange, cold feeling crept over me. I forced a chuckle, assuming she was hallucinating. "Who is he?" I asked softly, trying to reassure her. Her grip on my wrist tightened. "He watches at night," she said in a voice barely above a breath. "Stands by the door. But don't look at him. If you do, he follows you home." A chill ran down my spine. I nodded, not wanting to upset her, and gently pulled my hand away. "Get some rest, Mrs. Holloway," I said, forcing a smile. But as I left her room, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling her words had left in me. That night, as I made my rounds, I kept noticing small things that felt off. The motion sensor light in the hallway would flicker on when no one was there. My shoulder would feel heavy, like someone was standing right behind me. And once, as I checked a patient's vitals, I thought I saw a shadow move in my peripheral vision. But when I turned, nothing was there. Then, around 2 a.m., as I walked past the end of the hall where the storage room was, I felt it. A presence. I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. The hallway was dimly lit, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw something at the far end. A tall figure stood in the shadows. He wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound, just standing there. My chest tightened as I tried to make out his features, but there were none. His face was completely blank. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, just darkness. A sickening wave of dread washed over me. Mrs. Holloway's words rang in my ears. "Don't look at him. If you do, he follows you home." I turned away so fast my vision blurred. I didn't run, but I walked as quickly as I could in the opposite direction, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. When I reached the nurse's station, I forced myself to take deep breaths. I wanted to tell someone, but what would I say? That I saw a man with no face? They'd think I was sleep-deprived or worse. The next morning, when I went to check on Mrs. Holloway, I found her bed empty. She had passed away in her sleep during the early hours. I stood there for a moment, gripping the edge of the bed, a strange heaviness settling in my chest. I had so many questions. I wanted to ask her, was it just a coincidence? Was my mind playing tricks on me? Or had something actually been watching me that night? Had it followed me? The thought made my skin crawl. I replayed the night in my head, every flicker of the hallway light, every shadow in my peripheral vision. Had I been alone? Or was something standing just beyond my sight, waiting? Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone is standing at the foot of my bed. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that there's nothing there, but I never check. I never look. Hospitals are places of science, logic, and healing, but sometimes they also hold secrets beyond our understanding. These stories remind us that not everything can be explained, and sometimes the things that go bump in the night are more real than we'd like to believe. What do you think? Have you ever experienced something strange in a hospital? Let us know in the comments. And if you love chilling stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Stay safe, and until next time, keep the lights on.